Hello and welcome to tonight's story, a deep journey into one of the darkest and most dangerous paths a person could walk in the year 1580. Before we begin, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories we tell. And I want to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Write your location in the comments and let's see how far our voices travel. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let's step back to the year 1580, to a time when the word witch was not an idea from a fairy tale, but a sentence that could end your life. In the late Middle Ages, though the Renaissance had begun to breathe new ideas into some corners of Europe, suspicion, superstition, and fear of the unknown still ruled entire communities. The witch hunts of this period, though varying in intensity from place to place, were woven into the daily life of towns and villages, fueled by both religious fervor and the deeply rooted belief that the devil could walk among men, disguised in the form of a neighbor, a midwife, or a lonely widow. To be accused was to have the earth shift beneath your feet. There was no safe place to stand. The court of public opinion was more powerful than any judge, and whispers in the marketplace could be the first signs that your life was about to be torn apart. It didn't matter whether you had ever cast a spell, brewed a potion, or even spoken of magic being different was enough. Maybe you knew how to heal with herbs when the local doctor failed. Maybe you had eyes that people called strange. Or maybe you were simply too outspoken for the comfort of those around you. All of these could draw attention, and attention was dangerous. In 1580, the church and state often worked together to root out heresy, and witchcraft was considered one of the gravest heresies of all. Inquisitors traveled from place to place, their arrival feared as much as famine or plague, because they brought with them an air of judgment that clung to everyone. Trials were not trials as we understand them now. There was no guarantee of defense, no right to remain silent without it being taken as proof of guilt. Interrogations could involve days without food or sleep, as questions were repeated until the mind became fogged and the will broke. Confessions were the goal, and truth was less important than the performance of repentance. Under torture, the mind will say anything to make the pain stop, and so many confessed to crimes they had never even imagined. These confessions, often extracted through pain, were taken as proof not only of the accused's guilt, but of the existence of vast conspiracies of witches working together to harm the Christian world. This in turn justified more hunts, more trials, and more deaths. To live in 1580 as a woman, especially one without the protection of a powerful family, was to live under the constant shadow of this possibility. It shaped how you spoke, how you dressed, how you worked, even how you looked at other people. A misinterpreted glance, a misunderstood word could be the beginning of the end, and if the accusation came, there was often no escaping it. Your home could be searched, your belongings examined for witch marks, any tool of your trade twisted into evidence of sorcery. A broom was not just a broom if you were accused it was a means of flight. A pot of herbs was not medicine but poison. Even a cat could become an accomplice in the eyes of your accusers. The fear was not only of death, but of the way death came. Burnings, hangings, and drownings were common, but each place had its own preferred method. Some regions favored public executions, turning them into spectacles meant to warn others, while others carried them out quietly at dawn, as if to hide the cruelty under a blanket of routine. Either way, the message was clear: witchcraft would not be tolerated, and mercy was a rare commodity. For those who escaped execution, life was hardly a victory. You could be banished, stripped of your possessions, your name blackened beyond repair. Friends would avoid you, neighbors would cross themselves when you passed, and work would be impossible to find. It was a slow death, stretched out over months or years. And through it all, the fear spread, growing like a disease. It infected families, turning brother against sister, husband against wife, parents against children. In the Middle Ages of 1580, survival was not simply about avoiding famine or war, it was about avoiding the wrong kind of notice. To keep your head down was to live. But even that was no guarantee. The sky above might seem the same as it had for centuries, but on the ground, the rules had changed, and the wrong word, spoken to the wrong ear, could end everything. This was the reality of being a so-called witch in 1580, and we are only at the beginning of the story. In 1580, the smallest detail could shift the fragile balance of your life from safety into mortal danger. And while the image of the witch has been reshaped in the modern mind into something cloaked in mystery or even glamour, in the streets and fields of a late medieval village, it was an image twisted by fear, suspicion, and the politics of power, a shadow used to control and to purge, to strip away rights and silence voices that were deemed inconvenient. The suspicion did not start with the knock on the door by the town bailiff. It began earlier, quietly, in the marketplace, when a loaf of bread went bad and someone remembered you had glanced at the baker in a way they didn't like, or when a child fell ill and a neighbor recalled you had refused to lend them a piece of cloth last winter. Memory was malleable, and in an age where illness could strike without warning and crops could fail overnight, the mind sought cause and the heart sought someone to blame. Often the accused were women whose knowledge of herbs, childbirth, or local lore made them both useful and frightening. Because if you could heal, perhaps you could harm. And if you could bring a child safely into the world, perhaps you could also call upon the devil to steal it away. The written laws of many regions in Europe listed witchcraft alongside treason, giving it the weight of a crime against both God and ruler, which meant that your trial was not only a matter of faith but also a matter of state security. Inquisitors and magistrates took such charges seriously because to them, rooting out witchcraft was not just saving souls, it was preserving the stability of the realm. Trials, when they came, were rituals in themselves, public enough to serve as warnings, structured enough to appear as justice, but crafted in such a way that the path to acquittal was almost invisible. The evidence could be as flimsy as a rumor, yet it would be dressed up with solemn oaths and the testimonies of those eager to please the court or shield themselves from suspicion. Even the way you bore yourself under questioning could be twisted against you. Defiance was proof of guilt. Tears were seen as an admission. Silence was interpreted as contempt for the process. Once accused, you might be subjected to the swimming test, where you were bound and cast into water to see if you would float a sign, they said, that the water rejected you as unholy. Or you might be searched for the so-called devil's mark, a blemish, mole, or scar that could be pricked with a needle without causing pain, which was taken as proof of a pact with Satan. These procedures, though absurd by modern standards, carried the full weight of law and religion, and to resist them was to resist both God and King. In the cold stone chambers where interrogations were held, the air was heavy with the smell of damp, tallow, and fear. Here, the accused would be confronted with their supposed crimes, often a litany so fantastical that even the most vivid storyteller would struggle to imagine them. Flying through the night to secret gatherings, dancing with demons, spoiling milk, cursing livestock, or luring the faithful away from the church. Yet under the press of hours, days, and nights without rest, the mind began to accept the script handed to it, and words that were once denied slipped from cracked lips as if they might unlock the door and let light back in. For some, the confession did lead to a swifter death, and perhaps that was the closest thing to mercy the system allowed. For others, it only prolonged the torment as their words were used to name others, widening the net, turning friends into suspects, and sowing distrust that could linger for generations. The year 1580 was a world poised between old beliefs and new sciences, but in the matter of witches, the old ways held strong because they fed on the most enduring of human emotions, fear. And as you walked through the narrow, muddy lanes of your village, head down, voice soft, steps quick, you could never truly know which shadow would lengthen into your own doom. By 1580, The machinery of accusation against those suspected of witchcraft was so well oiled that entire communities could be turned into silent conspiracies of fear, each person measuring their words and glances, because to speak too warmly of the accused might mark you as a sympathizer, and to speak too harshly might invite retaliation from those who feared you just as much. In this world, the very rhythm of life conspired against anyone who carried the wrong reputation. Because every season brought some hardship and illness in winter, a failed harvest in summer, a stillborn child in spring, and hardship demanded an explanation. Science had not yet replaced superstition, and the Church, both Catholic and Protestant, fed the belief that the devil's agents walked among the faithful. If a cow stopped giving milk, if the well water turned foul, if hailstones destroyed a field, people looked not to weather patterns or disease, but to the human faces they distrusted. The courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, did not require the kind of evidence we think of today. An accusation, bolstered by 2 or 3 credible witnesses, could open the door to arrest, and once that door was open, it rarely closed again without blood being spilled. To be accused of witchcraft was not to be tried in the way we understand justice. It was to be swept into a process designed to confirm the charge. Judges and inquisitors believed they were not merely arbiters of law, but protectors of a divine order, and any doubt in the guilt of the accused could be seen as doubt in God's will. The interrogations often began politely, with soft words and invitations to confess in exchange for mercy. But this politeness was a prelude to the cruelty that followed. Torture was not merely permitted, it was sanctified as a tool to extract truth from the devil's servants. The rack, the strapado, the thumbscrews, the boot, each device had its own logic, its own promise that the pain would end if only the prisoner admitted what was demanded. And yet, those who confessed under such torment knew that their words would not save them. They might hasten the end, but the end itself was inevitable. The trials were public performances, often held in the largest available space, a church, a town square, a marketplace, so that the spectacle could sear itself into the minds of the living. Children clung to their mothers, men muttered prayers, women crossed themselves, and the accused, often gaunt and bruised, stood surrounded by armed guards, while the charges were read aloud in voices that echoed from stone walls. The accusations could include everything from attending a witch's sabbath to poisoning bread, from summoning storms to seducing respectable men into sin. Each claim, no matter how fantastical, was treated with grave seriousness. Because in a world without clear boundaries between the natural and the supernatural, the impossible was always possible. The sentences, when they came, were final. Hanging was common, burning at the stake even more so in some regions, and in others, drowning or beheading was the chosen method. The execution itself was another form of theater, meant to cleanse the community by removing the supposed source of corruption. The condemned were paraded through the streets, sometimes in carts, sometimes forced to walk, with signs hung around their necks naming their crimes. Crowds gathered not only to witness, but to participate, throwing stones, spitting, shouting curses, as if their hatred could shield them from ever standing where the accused now stood. And yet, behind the roar of condemnation, there was often a quieter truth that many did not truly believe in the guilt of the person being killed, but fear of speaking out bound their tongues. To be a witch in 1580 was not simply to be a woman or man accused of dark arts. It was to be the embodiment of every unspoken anxiety in the hearts of neighbors, to bear the weight of grievances, jealousies, and misfortunes that could not otherwise be explained. It was to live each day with the knowledge that survival was a matter not just of skill or obedience, but of luck. The luck that no sudden storm would destroy the barley, that no infant would sicken in your care, that no influential rival would decide your presence was inconvenient. And in such a climate, it was not enough to avoid wrongdoing. One had to avoid being remembered at all. to slip through life as a shadow that cast no shape others could grasp, because in the Middle Ages of 1580, being noticed was the first step toward the pyre. By the year 1580, the role of a witch in the collective imagination of European villages had expanded beyond any single image or definition, becoming a shifting shape molded by fear, envy, and desperation. And this meant that for those living under the shadow of suspicion, there was no safe way to exist, because every choice, every action, every silence could be reinterpreted through the lens of malice. In small rural communities, where families had lived side by side for generations, grudges ran deep, and it took little more than a poor harvest, an unexplained illness, or an argument over a boundary stone to rekindle old resentments. The rhythm of life itself was a trap. People depended on one another for survival, and this dependence bred not only cooperation but also an intimate knowledge of each other's weaknesses. A midwife who had once failed to save an infant, a healer whose salve had not cured a wound, a widow who spoke too freely about her thoughts. These were the ones whose names could be whispered when the time came to find the source of misfortune. The social and religious climate of the late 16th century sharpened these dangers. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation had turned faith into a battlefield, and each faction was eager to prove its moral purity by rooting out heresy in all its forms, including witchcraft. Clergymen preached sermons that painted the witch as both a seducer and a destroyer, a willing servant of the devil who sought to unravel God's work on earth. In such sermons, even the smallest signs, a muttered word, a sudden glance, a charm hung above a doorway could be evidence of a pact with dark forces. The legal systems were no less treacherous. In many regions, specialized inquisitors or witch commissioners traveled from town to town, empowered to investigate and prosecute accusations with little oversight. Their arrival could turn a quiet community into a stage for paranoia. Suddenly, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and the safest position was often to accuse first, to redirect the attention of the authorities before it turned toward oneself. Interrogations were designed not to discover truth but to confirm guilt. The accused might be questioned for hours or days without rest, denied food or water, kept in darkness or exposed to cold, all under the belief that discomfort would loosen the tongue. When that failed, torture followed. The instruments were varied and brutal. The rack stretched limbs beyond their limits. The strappado dislocated shoulders. The boot crushed bones. The thumbscrews splintered joints. In some places, the ordeal by water was still practiced, the accused bound and thrown into a river or pond, with floating taken as proof of guilt and sinking as innocence, though the latter often meant death by drowning. Confessions extracted under such conditions were rarely questioned. They were entered into the record as the final word, sealing the fate of the accused. Once a confession was obtained, the trial moved swiftly toward sentencing. Public executions were common, not only as a form of punishment, but as a warning to others. The condemned might be paraded through the streets, jeered at, and spat upon, their supposed crimes proclaimed for all to hear. At the place of execution, crowds gathered in numbers far greater than those seen on market days, drawn by a mixture of piety, fear, and morbid curiosity. Parents brought their children to watch, believing that the sight would teach them the dangers of consorting with evil. The execution itself was often accompanied by prayers and hymns, as if the destruction of the body could redeem the soul. But for the accused, redemption was rarely a comfort. The pain was real, the fire or rope unforgiving, and the knowledge that one's name would be remembered not as a neighbor or friend, but as a witch, was its own kind of torment. In this world, survival depended on invisibility. Those who avoided accusation often did so by keeping their heads down, speaking little, conforming outwardly to the expectations of the community. But even this was no guarantee. A slip of the tongue, An ill-timed absence from church, a sudden change in fortune could bring the eyes of the village upon you. And once suspicion took root, it spread quickly, feeding on every rumor, every unexplained event, until it became impossible to separate truth from invention. The hardest part of being a witch in 1580 was not the magic real or imagined, but the knowledge that your fate was in the hands of those whose fear outweighed their compassion, whose need for certainty outweighed their willingness to doubt, and whose faith demanded not understanding but the eradication of anything that challenged their fragile sense of order. No many corners of Europe in 1580. The machinery of suspicion was not just an occasional eruption of fear, but an almost constant undercurrent, an invisible thread woven into daily life. And to understand how hard it was to live under this, you must picture a society where the boundaries between superstition, religion, and law were blurred until they were almost indistinguishable, where a prayer could be both a plea for divine favor and a defense against accusation, where every illness, crop failure, or accident demanded a culprit, and where the concept of the witch was both terrifyingly vague and lethally specific. To be accused was not merely to face a charge in a courtroom, but to be dragged into a drama that your entire community believed was about the fate of their souls. The church bells might toll not for celebration, but to call people to witness your questioning, and even those who doubted your guilt would often stay silent, for to defend you was to risk sharing your fate. Those accused could come from any background, yet certain conditions made the risk higher. Women, particularly widows or those without male protection, were especially vulnerable, as were healers who used herbs or charms outside the church's blessing, midwives whose work with childbirth was both respected and feared, and individuals known for outspoken behavior or a refusal to conform to communal norms. Old disputes could resurface in the form of whispered claims that a cow stopped giving milk after you walked past, that a child sickened after you muttered under your breath, that the wind shifted strangely when you entered a room. None of these were proofs in a modern sense, but in a culture steeped in omens and signs, they were damning enough. Trials were often held in public spaces, town halls, churches, even open-air markets, where the act of gathering itself created pressure. The accused would be surrounded not only by officials, but by the stares of neighbors, former friends, and sometimes their own relatives. Questioning could be repetitive and circular, designed to wear down the mind, to confuse the accused into contradiction. And contradictions, however minor, were taken as signs of deception, feeding the narrative that only the guilty needed to twist their words. Inquisitors often entered the proceedings with a list of common signs of witchcraft: the presence of a familiar spirit, an unusual mark on the body, knowledge of hidden things, or the ability to cause harm from a distance. Such signs could be discovered by examination, with the accused stripped and searched for moles, scars, or blemishes, any of which might be declared a witch's teat where a demon was said to feed. Resistance to such searches was considered further evidence of guilt. The psychological weight was immense. Imagine knowing that the more you defended yourself, the more cunning you appeared, and the quieter you became, the more sullen and dangerous you seemed. Family ties could fracture under this pressure. Some relatives disowned the accused to save themselves, while others tried in vain to intervene, only to find themselves drawn into the widening circle of suspicion. The community's moral fabric was reinforced by these sacrifices, as each public condemnation became proof that the village was vigilant against the devil's work. Executions, whether by hanging, burning, or other means, were not just punishments, but rituals. The slow procession to the place of death allowed time for public prayers, confessions, and final speeches, all meant to frame the event as a moral cleansing. For those watching, the smell of smoke or the snap of rope was both a warning and a reassurance, a tangible sign that evil had been confronted. Yet in truth, the real effect was to deepen the culture of fear. For if the devil's agents could be found among familiar faces, then no one was beyond suspicion. Survival strategies varied. Some sought refuge in the anonymity of larger towns, blending into crowds where personal histories were less known, while others clung to the safety of powerful patrons who could shield them from accusation. A few embraced the role forced upon them, using the fear they inspired to gain a degree of protection. But this was dangerous. Too much defiance could provoke even harsher retaliation. Ultimately, the difficulty of being a witch in 1580 lay not in practicing any forbidden art, but in existing within a web of beliefs that made innocence irrelevant. In such a system, truth was not an absolute. It was a story told by those with the authority to have it believed, and once your name entered that story, it was almost impossible to erase. In the cold, echoing chamber where trials for witchcraft were held in the year 1580, the walls themselves seemed to press inward, as though eager to hear every accusation and hold every cry within their unyielding stone. The space was dim, except for the flickering of tallow candles, their wax pooling thick on wooden sconces, casting a wavering light that made every face in the room seem alive with suspicion. Here, truth was not measured by evidence, but by the weight of rumor, by the strength of fear, by the will of those in power to make an example of someone. The accused stood in the center, surrounded by a low wooden barrier, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already chafed her skin raw. Her eyes, though hollow from sleepless nights, scanned the room in a desperate search for a familiar face that might hold kindness. Yet every gaze she met was either cold with judgment or burning with a kind of morbid anticipation. The judge sat high on his platform, robed in black, with the heavy leather-bound Bible before him, and a gavel that was less a tool for order than a signal for doom. At his side, the scribe dipped his quill into ink, recording each word as though transcribing Holy Scripture, knowing that his neat script would become the record by which the woman's fate would be sealed. The charges were read aloud, but they were not specific, not grounded in anything a modern mind might call proof. Instead, they were a tapestry of whispered tales, that she had been seen murmuring over the village well on a moonless night, that a neighbor's cow had stopped giving milk after she refused him salt, that a child had fallen ill after she brushed past his mother in the market. Each story, repeated over weeks, had hardened into truth in the minds of the townsfolk, so that when the judge recited them now, the assembled crowd did not hear allegations, they heard confirmation of what they already believed. Then came the examination for the devil's mark, a ritual both degrading and terrifying. A midwife or an appointed matron would be brought forward to inspect the accused's body in search of any blemish, a mole, a freckle, an old scar that could be interpreted as the place where the devil had touched her, or where a familiar spirit had drawn blood. Privacy was a concept unknown in such proceedings, and the act itself was less about finding anything real than about publicly humiliating the accused and giving the crowd yet another image to feed their certainty. If such a mark was found, it was declared incontrovertible proof, though everyone in the room knew, deep down, that every human bore such imperfections. But truth was irrelevant here. The purpose was to strip away dignity and replace it with shame. After the examination came the testimonies of witnesses, most of whom spoke not from personal knowledge, but from the safety of repeating what others had said. They spoke of butter curdling without cause, of livestock dying in the night, of strange lights seen near the accused's home, of dreams in which she appeared and cursed them. Dreams were given as much weight as waking observations, for in 1580 the boundary between the two was as porous as smoke, and a dream could be considered divine revelation. Those who testified were not always malicious. Some were simply eager to be seen on the side of righteousness, to avoid suspicion themselves, for in a climate where accusation was contagious, silence could be fatal. Each word spoken piled another stone upon the tower of guilt being built around the accused, until the possibility of her innocence was not even considered. The judge would then turn to the accused for her response, but it was not an invitation to defend herself. It was an opportunity for the court to hear her voice tremble, to watch her falter, to interpret her every hesitation as deceit. Some women shouted their innocence until their voices broke, others wept, others fell into a silence that was taken as either defiance or admission. In truth, nothing she could say would matter. The verdict was often decided before she had even been arrested. Still, the performance had to be completed, for this was as much theater as it was punishment. The scribe continued his steady scratching. The judge nodded gravely, and the crowd leaned forward as though watching the final act of a familiar play. The next stage was the ordeal, a physical test meant to prove guilt or innocence, but designed so that failure was inevitable. Perhaps she would be subjected to the trial by waterbound, and lowered into a pond or river to see if she floated, which would mark her as a witch, or sank, which would prove her innocence but often lead to drowning before she could be pulled out. Or perhaps it would be the trial by fire, forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces, her hands bound in linen afterward, and inspected days later to see if they had healed unnaturally, a judgment that could be swayed by nothing more than the mood of the examiner. Each ordeal was cloaked in the language of divine will, as though God himself were revealing the truth. Yet in practice they were nothing but instruments of fear and control. The accused knew, as did everyone present, that survival did not guarantee freedom. Even if she endured without visible injury, the whispers could persist, and the demand for execution could still be satisfied in other ways. The crowd, restless and hungry for resolution, cared less for fairness than closure, for the comfort of believing that evil had been rooted out and punished. And so, with each passing moment, the woman in the center of that cold chamber felt her life narrowing, choices slipping away until all that remained was the certainty that she would not walk freely from that place. The ropes cut deeper into her wrists, the candlelight danced mockingly across the stone, and the air pressed heavier with each breath, as if the very room were conspiring to hold her there until the inevitable came. Under the dim and heavy sky of 1580, life for a woman accused of witchcraft was not merely difficult. It was a slow unraveling of every thread that tied her to her community, her family, and her own sense of self. The trial might have ended in a verdict, but the true punishment began long before any sentence was carried out. For from the moment the accusation took root, it grew like ivy, winding into every corner of her life, choking out the light. The home that had once been a place of shelter became a cage, its walls echoing with the absence of visitors, the absence of laughter, the absence of trust. Neighbors who had once shared bread or helped mend a fence now crossed the street to avoid passing her door, muttering prayers under their breath as though even a glance might invite misfortune. The market, once a place of gossip and bargaining, became hostile ground. Where she used to stand at the baker's stall or weigh herbs in the apothecary's shop, there were now whispers behind cupped hands, sudden silences when she approached, eyes that followed her every movement, like the eyes of hawks tracking prey. Children, who had once run to her for sweets or stories, were pulled away by anxious mothers, warned not to speak to her, not to touch her, not to even let her shadow fall upon them. And if she dared to speak up, to ask why, the answer was always the same: a shrug, a quick sign of the cross, a muttered word about safety, about not taking risks. The church, too, turned colder. Though its doors remained open, its pews seemed harder beneath her, the sermons sharper, as though every passage about sin and temptation was aimed at her alone. The priest might not name her, but the pauses, the glances, the choice of scripture were deliberate, a slow poisoning of her reputation in the minds of the congregation. Confession, once a place of unburdening, became a trap. Any word she spoke could be twisted into evidence, any hesitation taken as guilt. Even the land itself seemed to change. Fields she had walked for years now felt alien, the paths unfamiliar, the trees watchful. A rustle in the underbrush, a crow's cry, the sudden stillness of wind all became signs to those who already believed she consorted with dark forces. If a fox crossed the road in front of her, it was a familiar spirit. If frost came early, it was her doing. If the moon hung low and red in the night sky, it was because she had called upon it. The logic of the age left no room for coincidence. In 1580, every misfortune needed a cause, and the simplest cause was the one standing before them, bound in rumor and fear. Within her own family, the fracture lines deepened daily. A husband might defend his wife at first, but the weight of the village's suspicion could bend even the strongest loyalty. Friends warned him to think of his children's future, of the land he might lose, of the trade he might be barred from if he stood too firmly by her side. Brothers and sisters might visit less often, until visits ceased altogether. Even those who loved her began to look at her differently. With eyes clouded by doubt, they could not admit aloud. And so, isolation became her constant companion, a shadow that walked beside her even when she was surrounded by people. Nights were the worst. Alone in the quiet, she would hear the creak of the roof beams, the sigh of wind against the shutters, the distant barking of a dog, all the ordinary sounds of a rural home, but in the fevered climate of witch hunts, each could be twisted into an omen. Sleep was shallow and often broken, haunted by dreams of fire and water, of rope and jeering faces, of her own voice shouting for mercy that never came. And with each dawn came the knowledge that the day ahead would bring no reprieve, only more of the same slow erosion. In such a world, the idea of escape flickered in the mind like a candle's wavering flame. Some women tried to flee before their trial, slipping away in the night to seek refuge in another town, another country. But travel was dangerous, and a woman alone on the road was as likely to be captured, robbed, or worse as she was to find safety. Others sought the protection of the church, claiming sanctuary, but sanctuary was not always honored, and even when it was, it meant confinement, a different kind of prison. To leave was to risk death. To stay was to await it. This was the cruel geometry of the witch hunts. Every path led toward the same end, only by errant roads. And yet, in the midst of such crushing fear, there were moments, small and defiant, when a woman might remember who she was before the accusation. She might hum a song her mother taught her while tending to her meager garden, or she might watch the sunrise over the fields and feel, for a brief heartbeat, something like peace. But these moments were fragile, always under threat, for any display of contentment could be read as proof of guilt, as though happiness itself were unnatural and one marked as a servant of the devil. Thus, she learned to guard her face, to keep her voice even, to let no one see her thoughts. The mask she wore became as much a part of her as her own skin, and over time, it was hard to tell where the mask ended and the woman began. The world in 1580 was not one that allowed for the complexity of human lives. It was a world that demanded simple answers to simple questions, and when it could not find them, it invented them. And so, to be a witch in the eyes of her neighbors was not to practice magic or consort with demons. It was to be the answer to a question no one dared ask aloud, the vessel into which the fears and failings of an entire community could be poured until she drowned in them. This was the true hardship, the true weight of the accusation. Not the trial, not the punishment, but the slow erasure of her humanity, piece by piece, until even she began to wonder if she had been someone else all along. By the time the year of 1580 reached its bitter middle, the machinery of suspicion had been grinding for so long that it no longer needed fresh fuel to keep turning it fed on itself, churning rumor into certainty, certainty into accusation, and accusation into the slow, suffocating ritual of public judgment. For the woman caught in its teeth, each day became a careful performance of normality. Yet even the most ordinary act could be twisted into proof of guilt. If she lingered at the well too long, she was said to be casting spells into the water. If she hurried away, she was hiding something. If she smiled, she mocked her accusers. If she frowned, she carried malice in her heart. The burden was impossible. To live under the gaze of dozens of eyes, all waiting for the smallest slip to confirm what they already believed. And those eyes were everywhere. The blacksmith, whose wife once borrowed herbs from her, now spat in the dirt as she passed. The miller's boy, who had played at her doorstep, now pelted her shutters with stones. Even the old woman who had once traded her bread for help with sewing would no longer meet her gaze, muttering instead about strange dreams that came after their last meeting. Dreams and visions carried weight in 1,580 in a world without medicine as we know it. Without understanding of disease or weather, the unseen was often believed more real than the seen. A cow that stopped giving milk, a child with a sudden fever, a storm that flattened a crop, all could be traced back to the shadow of a suspected witch. And as the weeks passed, those shadows lengthened, stretching into every corner of her existence. The magistrates and church elders knew this, and they used it. Their interrogations were less about finding truth than about bending a woman toward the answers they wanted. She might be summoned at dawn, made to stand for hours in the cold stone hall, questioned in front of men who already regarded her as guilty. They would press her about names, about meetings in the forest, about strange marks on her skin that might be the devil's brand. If she denied everything, they would say the devil had sealed her lips. If she admitted anything, no matter how small, it would be written as confession. And sometimes, the questions were not about witchcraft at all, but about those in power who she had spoken to, who she had seen in places they should not be. In this way, accusations of witchcraft became a weapon for settling unrelated scores, a blade that cut both the accused and the powerful who feared what she might say. Sleep became a dangerous luxury. For in her dreams, she might wander into memories she could not control. Memories of harmless acts that could, in the fever of the age, be turned into damning stories. A gathering of women to help with a birth, a visit to a sick neighbor, a walk in the forest to gather mushrooms, all could be painted with the same brush of devilry. And so she began to guard her mind as tightly as her tongue, forcing herself to replay only safe images before sleep, though even that was no shield against the restless tide of the night. The seasons marked her ordeal in ways the calendar never could. In spring, the earth smelled of renewal, but she could not plant without someone remarking on the way she handled seeds, as though she whispered to them. In summer, the heat pressed on her like the weight of stairs, and the air shimmered with the gossip that seemed to rise from every street. Autumn brought the harvest, a time that should have meant feasts and shared labor, but instead she watched from her doorway as neighbors gathered without her, their laughter carrying through the thinning air. And winter, with its long dark, brought the truest trial of all, the knowledge that in those months of hunger and sickness, someone would die, and someone would be blamed, and the blame would almost certainly lead to her door. The church bells rang for the dead, but to her they sounded like the slow tolling of her own fate. The legal process itself was a strange mix of theater and cruelty. Public examinations might be held in the square, with villagers crowding close to hear her words, to see if her eyes flickered in some incriminating way. The elders might bring in so-called experts, midwives who inspected her body for marks, wise men who claimed to sense the presence of spirits. These marks could be anything: a mole, a scar, a birthmark, and once they were declared unnatural, there was no way to argue otherwise. Sometimes they would prick the mark with a needle, saying that if she felt no pain, it was proof of witchcraft. But the truth was, in the terror of the moment, with the cold air numbing her skin and her heart pounding like a drum, sensation became strange, and even pain could be lost in the tide of fear. Rumors moved faster than she could counter them. A glance from her could sour milk. A muttered word could bring illness. A black cat near her home was her familiar. No amount of denial could undo such tales, for they were more satisfying to the listener than the truth. And as these stories spread, they became the very air she breathed, heavy, tainted, unavoidable. She found herself changing under the weight of it all. She moved more slowly, spoke less, avoided the places she once loved. The forest, which had been a place of peace, now felt like a trap. The marketplace, once a hub of connection, now felt like a stage where she played the part of the condemned. Even her reflection in a basin of water seemed altered, the eyes sharper, the mouth tighter, the skin drawn with lines that had nothing to do with age. And in the rare moments when she caught herself laughing, truly laughing, she would stop, startled, as though the sound were dangerous. To be a witch in 1,580 was not to ride the wind or dance under the moon, as the stories claimed. It was to live every moment under a cloud that could break at any time, to feel the ground shift beneath your feet with each rumor, each sidelong glance. It was to wake each day wondering if this would be the day the knock came at your door, the day the magistrates decided they had heard enough whispers to act. It was to carry the knowledge that innocence was irrelevant, that the truth was a coin no one wished to spend when fear was more valuable. And it was to know, deep down, that no matter how carefully you walked, no matter how still you kept your hands, the world around you had already decided who you were, and that decision was a sentence you could neither appeal nor escape. Under the dim and watchful skies of the late 1580s, when the frost clung to thatched roofs like a silent omen, and the streets of the village narrowed into winding, shadowed corridors of suspicion, the life of a woman accused of witchcraft became something both painfully ordinary and unbearably strange. For each hour she lived was an hour spent performing the role of the falsely condemned, and every movement was measured against the fear of how it might be seen. Even the way she lit a fire could be discussed in hushed tones. For if the flames caught quickly, it was said she had summoned them with the devil's breath, and if they sputtered and smoked, it was taken as a sign that her magic was faltering. The villagers themselves lived in a contradiction. They did not see they despised her, yet they still came to her in secret. A mother might send her son after dark with a cloth-wrapped loaf, whispering that her baby would not sleep, asking for an herb to steep in milk. A farmer might leave a small sack of grain by her door with no word, only to find, days later, that his cow's fever had broken. But these exchanges, if spoken of, were twisted. She bargains with the devil, they would say, trading cures for souls. And in this way, those who benefited from her knowledge by night condemned her by day. The church's role in this was both open and hidden. From the pulpit, sermons railed against the servants of Satan, weaving scripture into warnings so vivid that children clung to their mothers when she passed. Behind closed doors, priests and elders discussed her fate as if it were a matter of accounting how many testimonies they could gather, how much they could extract from a confession, how many more would attend services if she were tried publicly. These trials were as much about control as they were about belief, for in a world where famine, plague, and war loomed large, it was easier to point to a single cause of all ills than to face the chaos of reality. The nights became the hardest to bear. Alone in her small cottage, with the wind dragging its nails across the shutters, she would sit by the dying fire and listen for the sounds of feet on the path, for the voices of men who might come to drag her away. Some nights she thought she heard them, the crunch of boots on frost, the creak of a leather strap, and her heart would seize, her hands tightening on the edge of her chair. Other nights the silence was worse, for it left her alone with her thoughts, turning over each word she had spoken that day, each glance she had given, searching for what might have been used against her. Even dreams offered no escape. They came in fragments, the faces of women she had known, the smell of burning wood, the sound of water boiling over in an iron pot. And always, somewhere in the dream, the bell would toll, slow and heavy, and she would wake with the taste of ash in her mouth. But in the waking hours, the slow erosion of her life was most visible. Friends stopped coming. Doors closed a little faster when she walked by. The market stalls where she once lingered were now places where she felt the invisible circle drawn around her, the unspoken agreement that she was to be watched, not welcomed. Even the animals seemed to sense the shift. Stray dogs no longer approached her, and the hens in her yard grew restless when she passed. The power of the accusation was such that it became a truth of its own. No proof was needed, only repetition, and by the time the magistrates summoned her again, the village had already written her guilt into its memory. This time, the questioning was longer, the room colder. They asked about gatherings in the forest, about strange lights seen in the hills, about names she had never heard. When she denied knowing these things, they nodded to one another, as if her ignorance were the surest sign of deceit. They pressed her about the marks on her skin again, forcing her to strip to the waist so the midwife could search for the devil's seal. She stood, shivering, while rough hands prodded her shoulder, her ribs, her back. A mole beneath her collarbone was declared suspicious, and the needle was brought. She flinched when it touched her, but they claimed it had not drawn blood, and so they wrote it down as proof. In the days that followed, the air around her seemed to thicken. People crossed themselves as she passed. Children dared one another to run to her door and knock before fleeing. The baker's wife refused her coin, not for lack of money but to avoid the taint of her touch. And still, there were those who came in secret. Needing the very skills, they condemned a salve for a burn, a poultice for a festering wound. She gave these freely, not because she believed it would save her, but because to withhold them felt like the final surrender to the darkness they already imagined in her. To be a witch in 1580 was not merely to risk the pyre, it was to live each day as if the fire were already lit, its smoke curling into every corner of your life, staining even the moments that should have been untouched by fear. It was to feel the heat long before the flames, to breathe the ash long before the wood was laid, and to know, with a certainty that no prayer could ease, that the world around you had chosen its truth, and that truth was your undoing. Under the pale and brittle light of early winter, when the frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the thatched roofs, and the smoke from the chimneys hung low and heavy in the air, the village seemed to close in on itself, as though the cold had drawn the walls nearer, and the people tighter into their suspicions. For a woman marked as a witch, the season brought no respite. Instead, the short days and long nights deepened the sense of being hemmed in, of the world narrowing to a single path, one that led only toward judgment. The market square, once a place of chatter and exchange, had become for her a silent gauntlet. The stalls were lined with familiar faces that now looked away too quickly, their eyes darting elsewhere as though contact with her might pull them into the same dark fate. A butcher who had once slipped her bones for broth now kept his back turned, slicing meat with unnecessary force, while the weaver's wife, who had shared stories over skeins of dyed wool, busied herself with folding cloth the moment she appeared. It was not outright violence, but a steady erasure, the kind that stripped her of belonging without ever striking a blow. The church bell still tolled, summoning the faithful to hear words that, though wrapped in scripture, carried her name in every warning against sin, every image painted of Satan's handmaidens. Children absorbed these sermons like they absorbed the winter chill, letting it seep into their bones until the fear of her was as natural as the frost on the window. Some played games in the snow, daring each other to touch the door of her cottage and run, leaving behind smears of mud or crude symbols scratched into the wood. Each mark was a reminder that the village's gaze never left her. At night, the cold seemed sharper inside than out, for the air within her cottage was thick with the silence of isolation. She would sit by the hearth, her hands outstretched to the meager fire, feeling the heat reach only her palms while her back remained stiff with chill. The walls creaked with the sound of settling wood, and in those sounds she sometimes imagined footsteps, or whispers, the phantom echoes of the day's suspicions, returning to haunt her in the dark. Food grew scarce, not from lack of coin, but from the quiet refusals at every door. The baker claimed the bread was already sold, even when she saw fresh loaves cooling in the window. The dairyman shook his head before she spoke, mumbling about low yields. It was a slow tightening, a deliberate starving of her body to match the starving of her spirit. Yet still, in the deepest hours of the night, there were knocks, gentle, hurried, as if the visitor feared to be seen. A young woman came once, her cheeks wet with tears, holding a child who coughed so violently it seemed the breath might tear from his chest. Another time, it was an old man with a festering wound hidden beneath layers of cloth. They came without words, and she gave them what she could: herbs, poultices, whispered instructions, knowing they might not even thank her aloud, for to speak of her aid was to risk sharing her damnation. These acts, though small, anchored her to the person she had been before the accusation, the one who had learned the names of plants and the ways of the body not from any dark pact but from years of watching and tending. The magistrates, however, saw no such distinction. When the summons came again, it was carried by two men in heavy cloaks, their boots leaving deep prints in the snow outside her door. They did not explain, nor did they need to. The meaning was in their silence and the way they stood on either side of her as they walked through the village. Eyes followed them, peering from windows or half-open doors, some wide with fear, others narrowed with satisfaction. This time, the questioning was sharper, the words clipped and rapid, as though the answers were already known and her role was merely to confirm them. They asked of the gatherings in the woods, of strange marks on livestock, of storms that came without warning. Each denial was met with a glance between them, a note scratched into the parchment, a tightening of the mouth. When they spoke of the devil's mark again, she braced for the needle, the cold metal pressing into her skin, the search for a place where no pain would come proof, they said, of her unholy bond. She endured it without flinching, not from bravery, but from a numbness that had settled over her like a second skin. Released once more, she returned to her cottage under a sky so low it seemed ready to press her into the earth. Snow began to fall, fine and relentless, erasing the tracks behind her, as though even the ground wished to forget she had passed. Inside, she sat before the fire, the flicker of light catching on the few objects she still kept: a wooden bowl, a small bundle of dried herbs, a worn cloth folded with care. These were not the tools of sorcery, but in the eyes of the village, they were enough to damn her. In the weeks that followed, the cold deepened, and with it, the isolation. Her reflection in the small piece of polished metal she used as a mirror grew gaunter, the shadows beneath her eyes darkening until they seemed almost bruises. She moved less, spoke less, conserving her strength as though some part of her knew she would need it. And always, beneath the surface of her thoughts, was the knowledge that this was not a life to be endured indefinitely. The trials would come again, each one narrowing the space between accusation and sentence, until at last the path she walked would end at the place she had seen in her dreams: the stake, the crowd, the fire. In the Middle Ages of 1580, to be called a witch was to live within that future long before it arrived, to feel its heat in every stare, its smoke in every whispered word, and to carry the weight of its certainty as though it were already draped across your shoulders. Beneath the dim gray sky of early spring, when the frost was loosening its grip, but the earth had yet to warm, the threat over her life did not recede, but shifted into a new, more insidious form. For now, the village was no longer content to let her waste away in isolation. They began to circle, not openly, but with a slow, tightening suspicion that disguised itself as vigilance. The church bells rang longer these days, their echoes spilling across the fields like an iron summons, and from the pulpit came sermons that were no longer just warnings about sin but direct, vivid illustrations of the witch in their midst, painted with words so sharp and familiar that there could be no doubt to whom they referred. The priest spoke of women who brewed storms, of those who curdled milk in the pail and whispered to toads in the moonlight, and though he never named her, the children turned in their seats to look toward her empty bench, their eyes wide and unblinking. She stayed away from the services now, not because she no longer believed in God. Her faith was the one thing they could not strip from her, but because the weight of those stares, the smothering press of the congregation's silence, had become more than her body could bear. Yet absence did not protect her. Word reached her from the mouths of strangers, travelers who passed through the village and stopped at her door with questions masked as idle conversation. They spoke of gossip overheard in the tavern, of merchants warning one another not to trade with her, lest their goods rot on the shelves. In the evenings, when she gathered kindling near the edge of the forest, she began to notice shapes moving in the corner of her vision figures, lingering too long among the trees, the faint sound of laughter when she turned. They left no footprints she could follow, but in the morning she found traces of their presence. Stones stacked in strange formations near her doorstep, bundles of twigs bound with red thread, the skin of a small animal nailed to the lintel above her door. These were warnings, not meant to harm her outright but to fray her mind, to remind her that she was never beyond their reach. The local magistrate began visiting more often, not alone but with a small retinue, his boots tracking mud across her floor as he asked the same questions in different forms, hoping fatigue might coax her into an inconsistency. He spoke now of new witnesses, a shepherd who claimed she had stood on the hill during a lightning strike, a milkmaid who swore she saw her shadow moving against the wind. These were absurdities, yet each was noted carefully on the parchment that would one day become her indictment. The questioning no longer ended with words. They demanded to search her home, their hands rifling through her meager possessions, lifting each object as though expecting it to reveal some hidden blasphemy. Her herbs, once gathered openly, were now held up between two fingers like something foul. And when she explained their uses, her words were twisted into evidence of unnatural knowledge. The spindle her mother had given her was turned over and over in the magistrate's hands, its smooth wood suddenly an implement of sorcery in his eyes. And when they found a scrap of parchment with her own handwriting, a simple note to remember the planting days, they asked whose names these were, whose spirits she had bound with her ink. Outside the walls of her cottage, the mood of the village was hardening. The tavern keeper, who once served her a mug of ale in the corner without comment, now refused to meet her gaze, his mouth set in a grim line as he served others. A group of women, who had once shared gossip at the well, began drawing water earlier in the day, leaving none for her but the brackish dregs. Even the stray dogs, sensing the shift, began to bark at her approach, their hackles rising as though she carried the scent of something dangerous. Nights became the worst, for it was then that the knocking began again, heavier this time, slow and deliberate, a sound that did not seek entry but announced its presence like a heartbeat against the door. When she peered through the small window, the yard was empty, yet the air was thick with the lingering sense of being watched. Sleep came in brief, broken intervals, each one ending with the snap of a twig or the creak of settling wood that jolted her awake. Dreams began to merge with waking visions of the stake, the crowd, the smell of burning pitch, until she could no longer be certain which was memory, which was prophecy. The rituals they accused her of practicing were foreign to her, yet in the solitude of her fears she began to imagine them, not as acts she had done, but as images placed in her mind by the relentless litany of accusation. This was the cruelest part of their persecution, not the threat of pain, but the erosion of her own certainty about herself. Still, she clung to small acts of defiance. She walked to the edge of the forest to gather herbs, though her hands trembled as she bent to cut them. She lit her fire each night, even when the smoke might mark her presence to those who would harm her. And when the magistrate returned once more, parchment in hand, she met his questions with the same calm denials, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. For in this time, in the Middle Ages of 1580, survival for a woman accused of witchcraft was not a matter of clearing her name that was a fantasy, but of enduring each day's trial without letting them see the moment she broke, of walking to the very edge of the gallows in her mind and refusing, for as long as breath remained, to take the final step herself. The summer of 1580 brought no warmth to her life, for though the sun burned in the fields and the crops swelled in the soil, the air around her felt colder than any winter she had known, heavy with the quiet plodding of those who believed her fate was theirs to decide. The accusations had taken root so deeply now that even strangers who passed through the village heard her name whispered in the same breath as the word witch, and some made the sign of the cross upon seeing her, as though her gaze alone could curse them. The children no longer dared to follow her out of curiosity. Instead, they ran when she approached, pelting her with clumps of dirt or mocking chants before disappearing behind hedges. The local priest's sermons grew more pointed, woven with thinly veiled parables of women who consorted with the devil and were struck down by divine wrath. And each time the congregation laughed or gasped at his words, she knew they were imagining her in the role of the condemned, It was during one of these weeks, when the nights stretched endlessly in her mind, that she awoke to find a crude symbol carved into her door, a circle intersected by a jagged cross, smeared with something dark that smelled faintly of iron. She scrubbed it away, but the mark was recut 2 days later, deeper this time, as though the wood itself might carry the curse they wished upon her. She began to hear footsteps in the narrow lane outside her home long after the village had gone to sleep, slow and measured, pausing just beneath her window before fading into the darkness. At first, she told herself it was only the wind rattling branches, but then one night, when the moon was high, she caught sight of a shadow lingering against the wall, unmoving for what felt like hours, and the chill that settled into her bones told her it was no trick of light. The magistrate returned with a different tone in his voice, no longer feigning the civility of law, but speaking with the assurance of a man who believed his quarry had already been claimed. He accused her not only of witchcraft, but of causing the recent sickness in the village, a fever that had taken 2 children and left others weakened. The grieving mothers had named her in their wails, declaring that she had cursed their families after being refused a place at the well. The fever was nothing she could have stopped. Yet, in a world where reason was drowned by fear, her guilt was decided long before the first child was buried. They searched her cottage again, this time overturning baskets and smashing the clay jars where she stored her herbs. A small bone no more than the remnant of a bird she had found in the woods was held up as proof that she consorted with familiars, and a scrap of black cloth, once part of her winter cloak, was declared a devil's token. The men laughed as they seized these things, their boots grinding the fragments into the dirt floor. That night, she sat by the fire and felt the walls of her home press inward, as though the structure itself was trying to warn her of the noose tightening beyond its threshold. Still, she did not flee. To run would be to admit the guilt they so desperately wanted to see in her eyes, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. But she began to prepare in small ways, burying the few coins she possessed beneath the hearthstone, hiding her mother's spindle in the hollow of a tree beyond the village, memorizing paths through the forest that might carry her to safety should the need come. Yet with each passing day, the possibility of escape grew fainter, not because she lacked the will, but because she knew the forest was no longer a refuge. The villagers had begun patrolling its edges, claiming they hunted wolves but watching for her instead. The smell of smoke from distant fields, the sound of the church bell tolling for another funeral, the sight of blackbirds circling above all became signals that her time was drawing shorter. In the still hours before dawn, she sometimes imagined the stake being built, the wood stacked high, the ropes tightened. She could almost hear the murmur of the crowd gathering, their hunger not for justice, but for the strange, intoxicating thrill of watching a life end in flames. She thought of the women who had gone before her, their names now only murmurs in dark corners, and she wondered if, in those final moments, they had felt fear, or simply the release of no longer having to endure. But until that day came, she would continue to stand, to walk through the village with her head unbowed, to let them see that she still drew breath despite all their efforts. For in this age, in the year 1580, that defiance was the last and only form of freedom left to a woman marked as a witch. The autumn of 1580 arrived, not with the gentle turning of leaves, but with the sharp, relentless bite of suspicion that hung in the air thicker than any morning fog. And for her, the change in season brought no relief, only a deepening of the tension that had wrapped itself around her life like an unshakable shadow. The harvest was late that year, the fields yielding less than expected, and in a community where survival teetered on the edge of scarcity, misfortune demanded a culprit. The whispers that had once slithered through the tavern corners now rang openly in the marketplace, her name spoken not as a neighbor's, but as a warning. Mothers pulled their children closer when she passed. Men stepped aside as though the brush of her skirts might carry some unseen plague, and the priest's sermons had shifted from veiled allegory to outright condemnation, urging the faithful to root out the devil's servants before winter tightened its grip. She had lived under the strain of their eyes for months, but now there was an urgency, a readiness to act that seemed to thrum in the ground itself. She noticed it in the way the magistrate's men no longer bothered with polite inquiry, instead arriving at her door unannounced, their boots caked in mud, their hands resting on the hilts of their knives, as though the simple act of speaking to her required a show of force. They rifled through her cupboards, scattering what little food she had across the floor, overturning stools, pulling down shelves to watch her flinch at the sound of splintering wood. Each visit left her home colder, emptier, and yet she rebuilt it as best she could, not for comfort, but for the stubborn need to show them she was not broken. The nights grew longer, the winds carrying with them the mournful cries of animals being slaughtered for winter stores, and with those cries came a creeping dread that the same hands which butchered livestock might one day drag her into the square. The fever that had haunted the village in summer had faded, but in its place came a rash of stillbirths and failing crops, each tragedy tossed like kindling onto the fire of accusation. She began to hear her name spoken in the same breath as the words curse and blight, as if the natural cruelties of the land could be bound to her will. Her dreams became restless things, filled with visions of fire and smoke, of faces twisted in righteous fury, of ropes tightening around her wrists until her hands turned numb. She would wake in the dark, her breath ragged, the embers in her hearth casting shadows on the walls that seemed to move of their own accord. By day, she walked with purpose, gathering herbs not because she still believed she would be allowed to use them to heal, but because it gave her an excuse to roam beyond the village, to memorize the feel of each path, each twist in the forest trail. In these moments, she felt the weight of the years that had shaped her into something the world no longer wished to tolerate. A woman who lived alone, who spoke her mind, who did not bend easily to authority. She had been called stubborn before, but now that word had been twisted into dangerous, and dangerous women did not live long in this place. The first snow came early, a thin crust that covered the earth in silence, and with it arrived the rumors that the magistrate had been in private counsel with the priest and the wealthiest landowners. No one would tell her what was said, but the glances thrown her way in the days that followed told her all she needed to know. A decision was coming. She began to set her affairs in order, as much as a woman in her position could, sealing away the letters her mother had written her before her death, tucking away a carved wooden charm given to her by a long-dead friend, and burying beneath the hearthstone a small pouch of seeds she had saved from her garden, as if some part of her still believed she might return in another season to plant them. She walked into the forest one final time before the snow grew too deep, her fingers trailing along the bark of trees she had known since childhood, each one a silent witness to the life she had built in defiance of the rules that sought to bind her. She thought of leaving then, of vanishing into the vastness beyond the hills, but she knew it was too late. The net had been cast, and any attempt to slip through its knots would only tighten it around her neck. When she returned, the sky was the color of iron, and the air carried the heavy stillness that comes before a storm. That night, she heard the distant sound of wood being chopped, the thud of an axe biting into logs, the rhythm steady, methodical, unhurried. She told herself it was only the work of men preparing for the cold, but deep inside, she felt certain that somewhere, beyond her sight, the timbers were being shaped into something that would not keep out the winter, but instead feed the flames of it. She sat by her fire until it burned low, her hands wrapped around a cup of bitter tea, her mind circling the same unanswerable question. When the end came, would she face it with the same unyielding gaze she had shown all these months, or would she finally look away? The morning broke without sunlight. The sky pressed low and gray, as if the heavens themselves wished to keep their distance from what was about to unfold. And when she stepped outside, she could feel it in the air, that electric tightness, that awful stillness before a wound is made. The frost under her boots cracked sharply with each step, loud in a way that made her wince, as if even the ground objected to her passing. She had learned to read the signs of danger, long before the first accusations ever reached her ears, and she read them now in the way two men she had known since they were boys stood in the lane, their eyes fixed anywhere but on her, their mouths thin lines as though holding back the taste of ash. Down the road, the blacksmith's hammer fell not in its usual rhythm, but in a single heavy strike that rang and then stopped, the silence afterward heavy with unspoken meaning. She moved quickly that morning, gathering wood for the fire, feeding the hens, pretending for the benefit of any watcher that her life was still her own to tend to, though inside she felt the hours collapsing toward a single point. By mid-morning, she saw them, the magistrate's men, 5 of them, their cloaks drawn close against the cold, their boots leaving a dark trail in the frost. They did not call out to her as they might have on any other day. They walked with the deliberate pace of men carrying out something inevitable, their eyes set straight ahead, their mouths tight with the knowledge of their errand. When they reached her, they did not knock, did not greet her the tallest of them, simply announced that she was to come with them, his voice as flat as a gravestone. She asked if she might bring her shawl, and they allowed it, perhaps thinking the gesture small enough to cost them nothing. She wrapped it around her shoulders, not for warmth, but as a final act of possession, one thing that still belonged to her. They did not bind her hands at first, perhaps believing that a woman alone in the heart of winter would not try to run. But when she glanced toward the narrow path that led into the woods, she saw the faint twitch in the fingers of the man nearest to her, ready to reach for rope at the slightest movement. The village square was not far, but the walk felt endless, every step echoing in her chest. She could hear the faint murmur of people gathering ahead, their voices low, but carrying the unmistakable tone of anticipation. She had seen this before, not for herself, but for others, the way a community transformed in these moments, how fear and hunger for spectacle braided together until they were indistinguishable. When they reached the square, the crowd parted without being asked, creating a narrow corridor through which she was led to the steps of the meeting house. Inside, the air was thick with the heat of too many bodies packed into too small a space, the scent of damp wool and unwashed skin heavy enough to make her dizzy. At the far end sat the magistrate, flanked by the priest and 2 elders whose wealth was visible in the quality of their clothes. Before them lay a table, and upon it a small collection of items taken from her home, a bundle of dried herbs, a carved bone charm, a jar of salve, each one now stripped of its humble purpose and recast as proof of her guilt. The accusations were read aloud, each word measured and deliberate. She had cursed the fields, caused the death of children, consorted with spirits, spoken against the order of God. No evidence beyond rumor and fear, yet each charge was met with murmurs of agreement from the crowd. She did not speak in her defense at first, knowing too well that her words would not be weighed against truth, but against the need for someone to bear the weight of the village's misfortune. When the magistrate demanded she answer, she lifted her head and spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the dryness in her throat. She told them she had healed the sick, that she had tended to their wounds when no one else would, that the same herbs they now called cursed had once saved their children's lives. But her words slid off them like rain on oiled leather. Their decision had been made long before this gathering. The priest rose then, his voice rising with each sentence as he spoke of the devil's cunning, of how he wore the faces of the kind and the helpful to draw souls into damnation. He pointed to her as though she were not a woman but a living snare, and the crowd shifted closer, the air thickening with the heat of their breath. The magistrate conferred briefly with the elders, their heads bent together, their expressions grim but resolved. When he spoke again, it was to declare that she would be held until the following dawn, at which time she would face the water trial to prove her innocence. She knew then that there would be no proving the trial itself was the sentence. As they led her away to the small, dark room beneath the meeting house, she felt the last fragile thread of hope pull taut and snap. The cell was little more than a pit with walls of damp stone, the straw on the floor matted and cold. Through the small slit of a window high above, she could see the faintest strip of sky, a dull iron color that told her the storm would break soon. She sat in the corner, pulling her shawl tighter around her, listening to the muffled sounds of the village above the creak of carts, the murmur of voices, the clatter of wood being stacked for fires that would warm homes she would never see again. She thought of the seeds buried beneath her hearthstone, of the path through the forest, of the touch of bark beneath her fingertips. She thought of her mother's voice, long gone now, and the way it would have told her to stand, to look them in the eyes, to leave them no satisfaction in her fear. And as the darkness deepened, she decided she would do exactly that, no matter what the morning brought. When dawn crept in, it did so without warmth, the pale light sliding over the stones like something reluctant to touch them, and the sound that pulled her from the shallow, restless half-sleep was not the call of a bird or the chatter of early risers, but the hollow thud of boots descending the narrow stairs to her cell. The door scraped open and two men entered, their faces set in that rigid, impersonal mask worn by those who want to believe they are instruments rather than executioners. They told her it was time, their voices low but devoid of kindness, and when she stood, the taller of the two stepped forward and bound her wrists with coarse rope, the fibers biting into her skin. The walk to the river was longer than she remembered it, the path winding between houses whose shutters were closed, yet not tightly enough to hide the glint of eyes peering out. Behind her, the crowd followed, their numbers growing with each street passed, their footsteps a steady murmur in the frozen earth. Children clung to their mothers, some with curiosity bright in their faces, others with fear, as though the sight of her might stain them. At the riverbank, the magistrate and priest were already waiting, their cloaks drawn close against the wind that came slicing off the water. The river itself was dark, the surface broken by shifting plates of ice that cracked and swirled in slow, deliberate circles. A platform of rough-hewn planks had been built near the edge, its timbers slick with frost, and beside it lay the rope and pulley that would decide her fate. The magistrate stepped forward and, in a voice pitched to carry over the crowd, recited the terms of the trial. She would be bound and lowered into the water. If she sank, she would be deemed innocent and spared, though all knew that spared in that case meant only that her body would be retrieved lifeless from the current. If she floated, she would be judged guilty and put to death before the day's end. The priest then spoke, his words thick with the conviction of someone who had rehearsed them many times, describing the purity of water, how it rejected the touch of those in league with darkness. His eyes swept over the crowd, and in them she saw the fever of belief, the kind that left no room for doubt, no space for mercy. When they took her by the arms and led her onto the platform, the cold rose up from the river like a living thing, curling around her ankles, seeping through her shoes. They looped the rope beneath her arms and around her chest, the knot tight enough to steal her breath, and then they lowered her slowly toward the water. The first touch was a shock, the icy grip stealing the warmth from her body in an instant. But she forced herself to keep her gaze fixed on the far bank, on the line of bare trees etched against the winter sky. As they lowered her deeper, the cold became a pain so sharp it felt almost like heat, and then her legs were under, her skirts dragging heavy with the weight of the water. The river closed over her head, muffling the roar of the crowd, turning the world into a dim, green-gray silence broken only by the pounding of her heart. She let herself sink, willing her body to go limp, to fall heavy, to be claimed by the current, but the rope pulled taut before she could vanish into the depths. And then she was rising again, dragged back toward the air and the noise and the eyes that waited to see the verdict. When her head broke the surface, the gasps from the crowd told her all she needed to know. She had floated. Whether it was the rope beneath her arms or the air trapped in her clothes that kept her up, it did not matter. The proof they sought had been delivered. The magistrate's voice rang out, declaring her guilty, and the crowd's murmur swelled into something louder, a wave of sound that rolled over her as they hauled her onto the platform. She lay there shivering, the water streaming from her clothes, freezing almost instantly in the wind, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. She looked up at the pale sky. its color now the same as the river ice, and thought of how the seasons would turn without her, how the wildflowers would bloom in the meadows she had once walked, how the trees would leaf and then bare again, all without her hand to touch them. They bound her wrists once more and led her back toward the village, the crowd pressing close now, their voices sharp with excitement, some shouting curses, others simply staring as though she were already gone. In the square, they tied her to the post in the center, the wood rough against her back, the smell of old smoke and ash rising from its surface. The priest stepped forward again, offering her one last chance to confess and seek forgiveness, but she said nothing. She knew that confession would change nothing, that mercy was not the point of this day. The point was the firewood stacked at her feet, the tinder ready to take the spark, the eyes of the village locked on her, as if her destruction might somehow keep their own darkness at bay. As the first torch was brought forward, the wind caught its flame, bending it toward her, and she closed her eyes, not to block out the sight, but to hold within them one last vision: the path through the forest in summer, dappled with light, the smell of earth and green things, the sound of leaves whispering overhead. And when the heat rose against her skin, she held on to that place, because it was hers, and because they could never burn it from her. Under the blackened sky that evening, the village square still smelled faintly of smoke from the morning's ordeal, but the fire had long since died, leaving only the scorched post and the circle of ash as a grim reminder of what had taken place. The crowd had dispersed hours earlier, yet the weight of their judgment lingered in the air, clinging to the walls of the houses, seeping into the very stones beneath her feet. For those who remained, the spectacle was not over. There were still whispers to trade, suspicions to feed, and stories to shape into warnings for their children. And in the dim back rooms of the magistrate's hall, the scribes were already setting quill to parchment, recording the accusations, the trial, and the execution, as if each step had been a measure of justice rather than a ritual of fear. In that cold, cramped chamber, the ink dried quickly in the winter air, sealing her name forever alongside the charge of witchcraft, her life reduced to a single line in a ledger that would outlive everyone present. The men who had bound her and lowered her into the river sat at the tavern now, their mugs heavy with ale, their voices rising as they recounted their own part in the day's events. Some spoke of it with pride, boasting of their role in defending the village from evil, while others masked a quieter unease with forced laughter, uneasy that their hands still remembered the feel of the rope or the heat of the flames. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and steady, covering the ashes in the square, erasing the footprints of the crowd. By morning, it would look as though nothing had happened here, as though the earth had swallowed the memory of her screams and the smell of burning cloth and hair. But memory, she knew, did not belong to the earth. It belonged to the living, and it would stay lodged in their minds, surfacing in the quiet hours when the wind moaned through the shutters or when a shadow shifted in the corner of a room. For the other women of the village, her death was not just a warning, it was a mirror. They felt its reflection every time they spoke too loudly, laughed too freely, or lingered too long at the edge of the forest. They carried themselves differently in the days that followed, their heads bowed, their voices softened, their eyes averted, each one silently calculating how close they might be to that same post. In the church, the priest spoke of purity and the triumph of good over evil, his voice ringing out beneath the vaulted ceiling as if it might wash away the smell of smoke. He urged his congregation to remain vigilant, to guard their homes and their souls against the corruption that could lurk even in those they loved. And the people nodded, some out of conviction, others simply because it was safer than dissent. In the market, life resumed, though the air was thinner now, as if the space she had once occupied had been cut away, leaving a hollow in the fabric of the village. The baker sold his bread, the smith hammered his iron, and the children played at the edge of the square, their games quieter than before, their laughter tinged with the unease they had absorbed without understanding. Yet beneath the surface, nothing was the same. The village had fed on its own fear, and in doing so, it had changed. The men stood a little straighter when they passed the magistrate. The women kept their eyes lowered longer, and every conversation carried the unspoken knowledge that it could be twisted into accusation. Beyond the village, in the rolling fields and dense woods, winter deepened. The snow lay heavy on the branches, muffling sound, turning the world into a landscape of stillness and shadow. The forest paths were empty now, the hunters staying close to home, the foragers wary of straying too far. It was as if the trees themselves remembered, their bare limbs etched against the sky like the black lines of a warning. And in the quiet of the forest, where the snow fell without witness, there was a kind of mourning not for her alone, but for the loss of trust, the loss of the unspoken bonds that had once tied the village together. The fire had burned more than a life. It had burned a hole in the heart of the community, one that no snowfall could fill. Weeks later, her name was still spoken, though always in hushed tones, as if the sound of it might summon her spirit. Some claimed to see her in the corners of their vision, a shadow slipping between trees, a flicker of movement on the riverbank. Others swore they heard her voice in the wind, not crying out in anger, but whispering, as though trying to remind them of something they had chosen to forget. And the truth was, they had forgotten, or at least they told themselves they had, because remembering meant admitting the cost of their fear, the ease with which they had traded a neighbor's life for the comfort of believing they were safe. The magistrate's ledger closed on that winter's page, the ink faded over time, the parchment yellowed, but the stain on the village remained, and in that way, she was never entirely gone. Her absence was a presence of its own, one that lived in every cautious glance, every unspoken thought, every moment of silence when the church bell tolled and the people bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in the hope that they would never be the ones to feel the rope, the water, and the fire. Under the pale light of early spring, when the frost began to loosen its grip on the earth, and the river ice cracked like brittle glass, the village seemed to breathe again, though the breath it took was shallow and cautious. The days were longer now, and with them came the sense that life might return to something like normal, but normal had shifted, warped by the shadow that lingered over every conversation. In the fields, men bent to their work, sowing seed into the damp soil, but their eyes often flicked to the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness there. The women gathered at the well with their pails, but their words were clipped, their laughter rare, each one keenly aware that too much joy could be seen as defiance, and defiance as danger. The children, though eager to play in the muddy lanes, kept their games closer to home, glancing back often at the blackened post in the square that no one had yet removed. It was said that taking it down might anger God, that it stood as a reminder of the justice carried out in His name. But in truth, no one dared to touch it because it had become something more than wood and iron. It was a boundary marker, dividing the village into the time before and the time after. And in the time after, everyone was careful. The priest's sermons shifted subtly, dwelling longer on the sins of pride and vanity, warning of the dangers of curiosity and the folly of stepping beyond the bounds set by tradition. He spoke of the devil's cunning, how he could hide in the guise of kindness, in the charm of a stranger, in the smile of someone you thought you knew. And though he did not name her, everyone knew who he meant. Her story was already becoming legend, reshaped with each telling in one version. She had danced naked in the moonlight with spirits. In another, she had brewed poisons from herbs gathered in the forest. In yet another, she had spoken curses that caused the harvest to fail. None of these stories matched the truth, but the truth mattered little now. Stories were safer than truth. Truth had teeth. At night, the village shuttered itself in, the light of hearths flickering behind closed doors, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and tallow. And beyond the walls, the forest kept its secrets. Travelers passing through told of other villages, other trials, other women who had stood where she had stood. Some said the hunts were spreading, that fear was moving faster than the seasons, carried by word of mouth and the heavy tread of the magistrate's men. Others said it would burn itself out, that people would grow tired of the constant suspicion. But those who lived here knew better. Fear was not a fire that burned out, it was a coal, glowing quietly, waiting for the breath that would make it blaze again. On certain nights, when the wind came down from the hills and rattled the shutters, some claimed to hear the old songs, the ones she used to hum under her breath while working, the ones that sounded half like prayer and half like something older, wilder. They said the sound curled through the alleys, wound around the houses, and lingered at the doors, as though searching for a way back in. No one opened their door when they heard it. And so the village lived in this uneasy balance, each day an act of caution, each word weighed before it left the tongue. It was not that they believed themselves safer, it was that they believed there was no safety, only the hope of being overlooked when the next accusation came. And somewhere, in that unspoken fear, her presence endured, as real as the ash still pressed into the cracks of the square, as real as the rope fibers caught high in the branches of the tree where it had been thrown after the trial. She had become a part of the place, not as she was, but as they had made her a shadow that neither time nor snow nor spring could wash away. Under the dim light of the waning moon, when the earth was slick with the thaw of late spring and the air carried the mingled scent of wet soil and distant smoke, the village stirred with a restlessness that no one wanted to name. The hunts had slowed in the nearby towns, but here, in this little cluster of timbered houses pressed between the forest and the hills, the embers of suspicion had never truly cooled. A merchant from the lowlands, passing through with a wagon full of dyed cloth, told of a magistrate 2 days' ride south who had begun to question the cost of the trials, the burden on the people, the endless parade of accusations that led only to empty fields and fatherless children. But his words, though whispered at the inn, did not cross into the square, for the square was watched, always watched. The blackened stake still stood there, as rigid as the day it had been planted, though now moss had begun to creep up its base, as though nature itself sought to reclaim it. Around it, the ground was bare, no grass daring to grow where so much had been burned. Mothers still pulled their children close when they passed it, not out of fear that the wood would bite, but out of the memory it carried, sharp as iron. The priest spoke less now of witches and more of obedience. Yet the shift in his words brought no comfort. It was as if he sought to weave the memory of the trial into the fabric of everyday life, so that no one could forget, so that the thought of resistance seemed not only dangerous but unnatural. The women of the village, those who once gathered herbs or tended to the sick, now worked with their eyes lowered, their baskets lighter than before, for too many plants had been marked as dangerous, too many skills as suspect. A woman who once could soothe a fever with a poultice of willow bark now dared not even speak of it, for fear that knowledge itself might be twisted into evidence. And so the sick went without remedies, and the dead were buried quickly, their names spoken in hushed tones, as though illness too might be contagious to the tongue. At night, when the sky was clear and the stars sharp against the dark, the forest seemed to lean closer, the line of trees a jagged silhouette that hid more than it revealed. Some said the forest was where the witches went, and they escaped, that they lived there in silence, waiting for the world to change. Others said no one escaped, that the forest swallowed them whole, and that the sounds people heard in the small hours, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind, the snap of a branch under a weight too heavy for a fox, were the echoes of those who had perished within. The truth was that no one dared to test it. Those who ventured too deep into the trees often returned, changed if they returned at all. One young man, curious and bold, claimed he had seen a light deep among the pines, a flicker like a lantern swaying in a hand he could not see. He followed it, thinking it might be a traveler or a lost villager. But the deeper he went, the farther it seemed to drift, until the night closed in and he realized he no longer knew the way back. When he stumbled out at dawn, his clothes damp with dew and his face pale as the morning mist, he would not speak of what he had seen. After that, he kept to his work and his home, and when pressed, he only shook his head and muttered that the forest remembers. In the long hours before dawn, when the village lay quiet and even the dogs slept, a few would wake suddenly, their hearts racing, sure they had heard footsteps outside their doors. But no knock came, no hand turned the latch. Only silence, deep and heavy, as though the air itself waited for something. It was in these moments that the fear felt most alive, not in the trials, not in the sermons, but in the stillness between, when the mind could fill the dark with anything it chose. And in that stillness, the memory of the accused lingered, not as flesh and bone, but as an idea. A presence woven into the very timbers of the houses, into the soil of the fields, into the unspoken thoughts of those who still looked over their shoulders when they drew water from the well. Being a witch in 1580 was not merely a matter of accusation. It was a state of existence that could be forced upon anyone, a shadow that clung to you long after the fire had gone out. And in this village, that shadow was as much a part of life as the turning of the seasons. The summer of 1580 brought no relief, for with the warmth came travelers, and with travelers came stories, and with stories came fresh reasons to fear. In the markets of nearby towns, where fishmongers called over the din and the smell of salted herring clung to the air, whispers moved faster than goods. One tale spoke of a woman in a coastal hamlet who had been accused, not because she cursed a neighbor or failed to attend mass, but because a storm rose suddenly after she had been seen walking alone on the cliffs. The waves had claimed 2 fishing boats that evening, and by dawn, the people had decided that she was to blame. She was tied to a stake before the sun had fully risen, her cries drowned by the roar of the sea. Such tales traveled quickly, and by the time they reached this village, they had grown sharper in the telling. It did not matter that the truth was often a tangle of chance and fear. The effect was the same, another reminder that any act, any moment could be turned against you. In the fields, the women worked under the eyes of the reeve, who had begun to carry a ledger as though each movement might be worth recording. A missed day was noted, a pause to speak was written down, and though no one said so, the knowledge that one's name might appear on those pages sent a chill deeper than any winter frost. The old healer, once respected, had not been seen in weeks. Some said she had fled into the hills, taking her jars and bundles with her. Others claimed they had heard a cart in the night, the slow creak of its wheels, and the faint sound of chains. No one went to look, and by morning, her door hung open, the hearth cold. The children asked after her, for she had been kind to them, carving small wooden animals from scraps of oak, but their mothers hushed them quickly. To speak too much of the gone was to invite questions, and questions had a way of turning back upon the asker. In the evenings, the men gathered in the tavern, their talk low and guarded. They spoke of harvests, of prices, of the weather, but the shadow of the trials lay across every word. When the door opened, all eyes flicked toward it, a momentary tightening of shoulders until they saw it was only another neighbor. Once, the tavern had been a place of laughter, of songs that rose with the smell of ale, but now even the music had faded. A lone fiddler might play in the corner, yet his tunes were slower, softer, as if to draw no attention from the night beyond the windows. Those who passed the tavern on their way home often glanced at its door, tempted to step inside for warmth, yet they kept walking, unwilling to be seen in any place where tongues might loosen. The priest, sensing the unease, preached more often on submission than on salvation. He spoke of the dangers of pride, of the sin of questioning, and though his words were couched in scripture, their meaning was plain. Obedience was safety, or so he claimed. But in the hush after his sermons, when the congregation filed out beneath the gaze of the carved saints, some faces showed the cracks in that belief. There were those who understood that safety, as it was now given, was only the absence of punishment, and that could vanish as quickly as smoke. The forest grew thick that year, the branches heavy with leaves, the undergrowth dense enough to swallow sound. At night, the wind carried scents from within damp earth, crushed nettle, the faint sweetness of wild berries, but also something else, something metallic and strange. No one wanted to be the one to name it. A girl gathering firewood near the edge claimed she saw a figure among the trees, dressed in black, standing utterly still. When she blinked, it was gone, and though her father laughed it off as her imagination, he did not let her return there alone. In truth, even the boldest hunters had begun to skirt the deeper paths, for they knew that the forest did not forget, and those who went missing within it were rarely spoken of again. The fear had settled now into the bones of the village, a quiet, enduring presence that shaped every choice, every glance, every silence. To live here was to live with the knowledge that you might one day be called a witch, not because of what you did, but because someone, somewhere, found it useful to say so. And in 1580, usefulness was more dangerous than any spell. The year turned, and with it came a winter so bitter that even the hearth fires seemed reluctant to burn. Snow lay thick on the roofs, pressing down until the thatch sagged, and the narrow lanes between houses became tunnels of packed ice. The cold slowed everything. The river froze at its edges, the mill wheel turned sluggishly, and the bells in the church tower rang with a duller tone. Yet the fear did not slow. It only grew sharper, more brittle, like the frost patterns that crept across every window. With the fields lying dormant, there was less work to occupy the hands, and idle hands left space for whispers. The accusations, once sporadic, began to fall with the regularity of the snow. A woman who had helped deliver a neighbor's child was accused when the infant fell ill. A man who had traded with strangers on the road was said to be trafficking in charms. These charges were not shouted in the market now. They were spoken quietly to the priest, to the reeve, to the magistrate, and it was in these quiet exchanges that fates were decided. In the evenings, smoke from a dozen chimneys curled upward into the still air, carrying with it the smell of burning pine and the occasional sharper tang of something else, the scent of burning cloth, burning thatch, burning hair. Those who knew did not say, and those who did not know did not ask. The gallows stood black against the snow on the far edge of the village, a place where the wind always seemed to cut deeper. Once it had been used rarely for thieves or murderers. Now it was being rebuilt, its beams reinforced, as if in preparation for heavier use. The carpenter who worked on it did so without speaking, his face pale, his tools moving with mechanical precision. He did not look at the rope. In the long nights, families huddled close, their breath misting the air between them, telling stories not of saints or heroes, but of those who had once been taken and were never seen again. Children listened wide-eyed, absorbing the unspoken lesson. Keep your head down, your voice quiet, and your thoughts to yourself. Still, there were those who resisted in small, hidden ways. A loaf of bread left at a door, a bundle of herbs smuggled into a cell, a prayer whispered not to God but to the one accused, as though words could pass through stone walls and iron locks. Such acts were dangerous, but they persisted. For in a time when the law could not be trusted, kindness became its own form of rebellion. Outside the village, the forest lay buried under snow, its silence deeper than ever. Tracks appeared where no one had walked, vanishing into the trees. Some said they belonged to wolves, others to things older and stranger. A trapper who followed them returned pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what he had seen. His traps lay abandoned in the snow until spring. The priest continued his sermons, his voice carrying through the frozen air, warning that the devil thrived in idleness and doubt. Yet more and more, the faces turned toward him were blank, eyes dull, not from agreement but from exhaustion. It was hard to fear damnation when every day already felt like a sentence. The trials, when they came, were held indoors now, in the council hall, where the cold seeped through the stone walls and the air smelled of damp wool and smoke. The accused were brought in with their hands bound, their breath clouding before them, and seated on a rough bench before the magistrate. Questions were asked in a tone that made the answers irrelevant. Witnesses spoke of dreams, of feelings, of signs seen in the flight of birds. The accused rarely protested for long. They had learned that silence lasted longer than words. Outside, the villagers gathered in the snow, waiting for the verdict they already knew. And when the doors opened and the condemned were let out, the crowd parted without a sound, as if to keep the frost from hearing. In 1580, to be called a witch was not a matter of guilt or innocence. It was a season, like winter itself, inevitable, consuming, and beyond any one person's control. And like winter, it could last far longer than you thought possible. Spring did not arrive gently that year. The thaw came sudden and violent, the river breaking free of its ice with a sound like distant thunder, flooding low fields and carrying away anything not tied down. The snow melted into mud so thick that carts sank to their axles, and the air filled with the smell of rot as months of frozen waste came back to life. Yet even as green shoots began to pierce the wet earth, the mood in the village did not lift. The trials had not stopped with the cold. They had simply changed their form. Now, instead of blaming the long nights and hard frost, whispers turned to failed crops, sickly lambs, and a storm that had torn the roof from the granary. The accused were no longer only the old, the odd, or the solitary. A baker's wife who had argued with a neighbor was summoned. A shepherd who had lost half his flock in the flood was called to answer for why the water rose so high. Each case followed the same rhythm: accusation, interrogation, punishment, until it felt less like justice and more like ritual. The gallows, still standing on the edge of the village, now leaned slightly, its timbers warped from winter's weight, but it was never empty for long. Children, forbidden to go near, dared each other to touch the base, returning with wide eyes and whispered boasts of having felt the chill of the dead in the wood. Some claimed to have seen shapes at night, swaying in the dark, even when no rope hung there. In the market, trade grew tense. Every transaction was a negotiation not just of price, but of trust. If a coin was tarnished, if a measure of grain came up short, suspicion followed. The priest preached harder than ever, his voice rising with the swelling river, warning that the devil's servants were clever and would hide their works beneath acts of seeming kindness. He told of tempests summoned by envy, of cattle struck barren by a glance, of bread that carried curses in its crust. People listened because not listening was dangerous, but their eyes flicked to one another, measuring, weighing, wondering who might be next. Outside the village, the forest turned lush again, yet the paths into it grew narrower. Few went far among the trees. The memory of winter's strange tracks lingered, and some said they still appeared on mornings when the mist was thickest. Hunters told of hearing voices where no one stood, of feeling watched even when alone. A boy vanished for 2 days, returning with torn clothes and a story he could not finish before breaking into sobs. His mother swore it was the work of witches, but no one dared ask which ones. Small acts of quiet defiance continued. A loaf passed from one hand to another under a cloak, herbs hidden beneath floorboards, a warning murmured before a name was spoken aloud. These were not enough to change the tide, but they were enough to remind those who suffered that they were not entirely alone. Still, the fear was patient. It needed no hurry. It knew that in a place where seasons ruled the pace of life, it could wait as long as it had to. And so it waited, curling through the air like smoke, slipping beneath doors like a draft, settling into hearts until it felt as natural as the rain. In 1580, the witch hunts were not a storm that came and went. They were the weather itself, the constant backdrop to every birth, every trade, every prayer. And no matter how bright the sun might shine on the river in spring, the shadow it cast was always there, waiting. The year 1580 was drawing toward its close, and with it, the fragile hope that the witch hunts might burn themselves out. But the air in the village had taken on a new heaviness, the kind that pressed into your chest and made every breath feel like it came at a cost. The summer's harvest had been meager, the wheat stunted and thin, and the apples had ripened early, only to rot before they could be stored. It was enough to convince those already steeped in fear that the work of the devil's servants was not just continuing but accelerating. People no longer needed a strange illness or a violent storm to suspect sorcery. Now, a bad loaf of bread or a sleepless night could be grounds for an accusation. The trials had become a kind of theater, drawing crowds from neighboring parishes who came not just to see justice done, but to feel the sick thrill of seeing a neighbor's fate decided in public. The magistrates, once reluctant to waste time on what they saw as superstition, now found the trials politically useful. They kept the people focused on an enemy that could be named and punished, rather than on the hunger gnawing at their own bellies or the taxes that left their granaries empty. In the dark corners of the tavern, conversations turned to who might be next. Men who had shared bread for decades eyed each other with suspicion. Women kept their voices low when they spoke of their ailments, knowing that too many complaints could be twisted into signs of a pact with the devil. The village priest walked the lanes more often now, his black cassock catching the dust, his hand lifting in blessings that felt less like comfort and more like inspection. He spoke in sermons of a war not fought with swords but with faith, insisting that the enemy was not at the gates but already within the walls, hiding in plain sight. He urged the faithful to watch, to listen, to report. And people did. A crooked smile, a muttered word, the wrong herbs hanging to dry in a kitchen all became cause for alarm. The accused often had no warning until the knock came at night. Torches would flicker against their shutters, shadows spilling into their rooms as they were pulled from their beds. There was no chance to explain, no opportunity to gather evidence in their defense. The walk to the magistrate's hall was short, but it might as well have been the march to the gallows. Once accused, innocence became almost impossible to prove. Confessions were wrung out through exhaustion and fear, sometimes with promises that mercy would follow, though it never did. The interrogations were relentless, their questions looping back on themselves until even the innocent began to doubt the truth of their own memories. Those who refused to confess were branded defiant, their silence treated as proof of guilt. Those who named others in desperation found no safety either. The noose did not loosen simply because it had been slipped over another's neck. Beyond the village, the land itself seemed to conspire in the cruelty. The forests were darker that year, their paths overgrown, as if they too sought to keep secrets. Travelers spoke of shapes glimpsed between the trees, figures that vanished when approached. At night, the wind carried voices that were almost words, but not quite, leaving listeners unsure if they had heard anything at all. In the fields, livestock sickened without cause, their bodies left to bloat under the late autumn sun. The villagers saw this not as misfortune, but as proof that the witches were growing bolder. The rituals to guard against them became more elaborate. Horseshoes were nailed above every door, iron keys placed beneath pillows, prayers carved into wooden charms worn around the neck. Children were taught not to look strangers in the eye, for fear that a single glance could curse them. The fear had become a habit, woven into every aspect of daily life. It dictated where people walked, whom they spoke to, even how they prayed. The trials were no longer a separate event from the life of the village. They were, its heartbeat, its grim rhythm keeping time as the year wore on. And as the first frosts crept back across the fields, that rhythm only quickened, promising that the cold months ahead would not bring stillness, but another round of accusations, another season of watching the gallows sway against the winter sky. By the start of the new year, the cold had locked the village into a brittle silence. Snow lay in hard crusts along the rooftops, and the lanes were narrow, packed walls of white where footsteps left dark impressions that froze almost immediately. The fires burned day and night, not only for warmth, but to keep the shadows from seeming too bold. Yet even the glow of the hearth could not soften the sharp edge of suspicion that had become as constant as the chill in the air. Winter made the village small. There were fewer travelers to distract with stories, fewer chores in the fields to keep minds and hands occupied. People were confined to their cottages, and in that confinement, whispers grew louder. Every cough, every restless night, every burst of temper seemed to feed a quiet ledger of potential guilt. The council's new decree had intensified matters. No household could keep more than a certain number of herbs, no gatherings after sunset without the priest present, and every death, no matter how natural, would be examined for signs of witchcraft. The magistrate's men had begun keeping a list, its pages thin and curling, of names mentioned more than once. Those names were spoken less often now, but when they were, it was with a weight that seemed to settle in the bones. The accused often didn't know they had been marked until the summons came. For some, it was a knock at dawn. For others, a hand on the shoulder during Sunday Mass. There was no dignity in the arrest, only a performance for those watching, a reminder that the law could reach into any life at any time. The journeys to the holding cell, usually in the back of the tavern or in a damp storeroom beneath the magistrate's house, were always the same. Heads down, wrists bound, feet crunching through snow that seemed suddenly too loud in the quiet street. Those who passed by rarely spoke. Eye contact was fleeting, as if looking too long might draw some invisible thread of accusation toward themselves. Inside, the interrogations took on a cruel intimacy. The rooms were cold, lit by a single lantern that smoked and hissed, casting the faces of the interrogators into shifting planes of shadow. The questions came in pairs, one soft and coaxing, the other sharp and cutting. Did they own a black cat? Did they ever meet in secret with other women? Had they been seen near the fields where the cattle had sickened? The answers were written down, even when they were not answers at all, but stammered fragments of protest. And always, there was the demand for names. The promise never kept that naming another would shorten the ordeal. Outside, the village adapted to the rhythm of arrests. Some households began keeping a bundle of clothes ready, just in case. Others quietly hid or destroyed items that might be seen as suspicious. Carved talismans from a grandparent, dried plants from last summer's meadow, books with too many margins filled in. The blacksmith kept his forge lit long after nightfall, claiming extra orders, though some whispered that he made more shackles than horseshoes now. The priest's sermons shifted tone. They were no longer about salvation, but about vigilance, about the duty to root out corruption wherever it hid. He spoke of the soul as a garden, warning that a single weed left untouched could choke the life from everything around it. His gaze would sweep the congregation, lingering just long enough to leave each listener wondering if they were the weed in question. Even the children learned the language of suspicion. Games were invented where one child would be the witch, chased until caught and tried before the others. It was a way to turn fear into play, but it also taught them, without anyone meaning to, that guilt could be decided by the loudest voices, not the clearest truth. The snow began to melt earlier than expected, leaving the ground muddy and uneven. With the thaw came fresh unease. The bodies buried in winter were exhumed in some cases, examined for marks or wounds that might prove unnatural death. The smell of disturbed earth and decay clung to the air around the churchyard. People walked faster there, eyes lowered. It was during this uneasy thaw that the largest trial yet began. 5 women, all from different ends of the parish, were accused within the same week. The accusations were varied, one for livestock deaths, another for a child's lingering fever, another for speaking to a stranger in a language no one recognized. But they were tried together, a spectacle meant to reinforce the image of a conspiracy. Crowds gathered from neighboring villages, their boots thick with mud, their breath clouding in the cool air. The women stood on the platform, wrists bound, their hair uncombed, their faces pale but dry-eyed. The magistrate read the charges, his voice carrying over the crowd, each word a stone placed carefully on the pile already pressing them down. As the trial dragged on, the details blurred. Witnesses contradicted each other, memories twisted to fit the story that had already been decided. The verdict, when it came, was no surprise. The punishment would not be swift. The execution was scheduled for the morning market, ensuring the maximum number of eyes to see it done. That night, the village slept lightly, the crackle of torches and the murmur of voices outside seeping through the thin walls of every home. Fear had become not just a presence, but a companion, lying down beside them in the dark, whispering that it would not be leaving soon. The morning of the execution broke gray and windless, the kind of stillness that made even small sounds carry farther than they should. The market square had been cleared of its usual stalls, replaced with a wooden platform hastily reinforced during the night. The smell of fresh-cut timber mingled with the faint, iron tang of the nails driven deep into the boards. People began to gather before the church bell marked the hour. Some arriving in clusters, others alone, faces hidden beneath hoods or scarves. The crowd's breath hung in the air like smoke, blurring the edges of their silhouettes. Near the platform, the magistrate stood with his clerk, speaking in low tones, their eyes flicking occasionally toward the side street where the prisoners would appear. The priest arrived next, robes heavy and damp from the frost, his hands clasped in a posture that could have been prayer or calculation. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, peering around them with wide, unblinking eyes. The sound of boots on cobblestone announced the arrival of the condemned. The women were led in a single file, their wrists bound with rough rope, the ends held by guards whose faces were expressionless, but whose knuckles were white with cold and tension. Their steps were slow, not from reluctance, but because the mud made each movement uncertain. They wore plain shifts, stripped of belts or adornments, their hair loose and tangled, dark against the pale of their skin. When they reached the platform, they were made to kneel. The ropes were adjusted, tighter now, the fibers biting into their skin. The magistrate began to speak, his voice loud and steady, reciting the charges as if they were truths carved in stone. He spoke of unnatural storms, of livestock found dead in the fields, of children who wasted away after meeting the accused. He spoke of midnight gatherings, of strange marks on doorways, of whispered words in languages no honest person would know. Each accusation drew murmurs from the crowd, the sound swelling and receding like the tide. The priest stepped forward next, his voice softer but no less heavy. He offered the women a final chance to confess, to name others, to seek forgiveness. His words carried the promise, unspoken but understood, that a confession might mean a quicker end. None spoke. The silence was not defiance so much as exhaustion, the knowledge that no word they uttered could change the shape of what was to come. The guards moved into place. The air seemed to tighten, the space between heartbeats stretching, until it felt like the whole village was holding its breath. The first woman was brought forward. Her eyes swept the crowd, lingering for a moment on a figure at the back before she was made to kneel again. The priest murmured something, but the wind caught his words, carrying them away. The executioner, a man whose face was obscured by a heavy hood, raised his hand, and the act was done. The sound was brief, almost swallowed by the murmuring of the crowd, but its weight settled over the square like a shroud. One by one, the others followed. There was no rush, no pretense of mercy. When it was over, the bodies were left in place for a time, the ropes swaying gently in the cold air, the wood beneath them darkening. The crowd began to disperse, some moving quickly, others lingering as if reluctant to turn their backs. Conversations were muted, as though speaking too loudly might summon something unwelcome. The magistrate and the priest exchanged a few words, then turned away, their cloaks brushing the damp boards. The guards removed the bodies, carrying them toward the edge of the village where a shallow grave had been dug in the frozen ground. No markers would be placed. The earth would be smoothed over, the memory of the morning folded into the larger fabric of unspoken things. Life in the village resumed, but the air had changed. The market stalls returned, the sound of barter and trade filling the square again, yet beneath it all lay the echo of that silence, the awareness that it could happen again. The list in the magistrate's possession still had names on it. Some of those names belonged to people who now kept their heads lower, their words fewer. Others seemed to move through the village unchanged, either convinced of their safety or too weary to feign caution. The children who had watched from behind their mother's skirts now played games in the lanes, reenacting the morning with laughter that didn't quite hide the truth they had absorbed. And at night, when the wind pressed against the shutters and the fire burned low, some swore they could hear voices, not cries, but whispers carried from the edge of the village where the unmarked graves lay. Whether it was memory, guilt, or something older, no one would say. They had learned well enough that in 1580, survival often depended not on innocence, but on silence, and on the ability to look away when the rope tightened.